The Waterloo campaign creates much debate and divides many opinions, particularly in who was to blame on the French side for their ultimate defeat. Personally, I believe that it is Napoleon, as Commander-in-Chief, who deserves to hold the ultimate blame. However, I also think that several other senior French commanders were at fault during these fateful 4 days in June. I therefore thought that it would be interesting to share and discuss my top 5 of these officers, who I believe should share at least some of the blame for Napoleon's final defeat. General Bourmont had been a late adopter of Imperial France, having fought against the revolution alongside the Vendean rebels in 1794 and even being suspected of involvement in the bomb plot upon the then First Consul Napoleon in 1800. However, despite fleeing France for a time, upon Napoleon's offer of amnesty to émigrés, Bourmont rejoined the French army in 1807 and served with distinction in many of the subsequent campaigns and actions, particularly in Russia in 1812, as well as the campaigns of 1813 and 1814, ending Napoleon's first reign as a general de division. Despite this, many senior generals in the French army remained suspicious of Bourmont's true loyalties, and this only heightened with how quickly he came to accept and support the reintroduction of the Bourbon regime in 1814. Therefore, when Napoleon returned to France the following year, the appointment of General Bourmont to command the 14th Infantry Division as part of Gérard's 4th Corps in the Armée du Nord raised many eyebrows. Marshal Davout, in particular, in his role as Minister of War, warned Napoleon against such an appointment, but under the assurances of Gérard, Napoleon stood by the decision. However, Gérard's loyalty to a friend was to prove both misjudged and potentially costly to the Emperor. In the early hours of June the 15th, General Bourmont, along with his Chief of Staff, left his headquarters and crossed into the Prussian lines, along with a full copy of the Armée du Nord's order of battle and marching orders. Although the Allies knew with surprising accuracy the French order of battle, this news confirmed their suspicions, and Bourmont's arrival gave them a warning of what was to come. Worse for Napoleon, however, was the impact that this desertion would have on the French army, as Adkin explains. The Allies barely reacted to Bourmont's desertion, but Gérard's formations were delayed while the confusion was sorted out, and Marshal de Camp Baron Hulot from the 1st Brigade assumed command of Bourmont's division. Gérard, the corps commander, had to personally ride up and down columns of angry, distrustful soldiers, assuring them of the loyalty of the officer corps and promising to lead them to victory. With these delays, as well as others concerning the state of the roads, Gérard's corps stood no chance of keeping to Napoleon's schedule, but they still did manage to cross the Sambre on the 15th at Chalais, as prescribed. Although they had done nothing except march throughout the day, they were close to joining the rest of the right wing, and were well placed to take part in the operations planned for the 16th. Arguably, therefore, the bigger impact of Bourmont's betrayal was the effect upon the morale of the soldiers. The worst fears of the soldiers were being realized, and it took considerable effort from other senior officers to restore order in his division. The majority of the lower-ranked officers and men were loyal to Napoleon, but they were equally suspicious of the higher-ranked officers, many of whom they saw as betraying both themselves and their emperor during the latter's abdication the previous year. This is something that even Wellington shrewdly identified when asked if he expected any of the French soldiers to desert. Not upon a man, from a colonel to the private in a regiment both inclusive. We may pick up a marshal or two, perhaps, but not worth a damn. Morale is vital to an army, as is the faith and trust that the common soldier has in his officers. Colonel Zenowitz, a Polish officer, felt that this desertion on the day of combat greatly affected the morale of the army. For the soldiers, who did not know how to hide their thoughts, they were so demoralized they saw traitors everywhere. They distrusted all their commanders. Others, however, felt that, because Bourmont's true loyalties had always been in question, his desertion came as no real surprise. The desertion of a few individuals, whatever their ranks, was only one more of those ordinary events, which was of no significance because we knew they were likely. Although the true impact upon the morale of the army, and in particular 14th Infantry Division which Bourmont left stranded, can never truly be quantified, the desertion of a senior officer on the eve of battle was certainly a poor omen for Napoleon, and not the ideal way to open such a pivotal campaign. Marshal Soult had started his army career in 1785, but during the Revolutionary Wars he quickly found himself rising up the ranks, even serving as Jourdan's chief of staff at the Battle of Fleurus. By the time Napoleon became first consul, he was a general de division, and after being put in charge of the training camp at Saint-Omer in 1803, the next year he was made a marshal of the newly founded empire. Soult played key roles in the campaigns of 1805 to 1808, serving directly under Napoleon, and being regarded by his chief as the best tactician in Europe. However, he was to spend much of the next 6 years fighting in the Peninsular War, and, despite some success against Spanish forces which helped to secure his reputation, he was continually bested and pushed back by Wellington, being ultimately pursued into southern France by war's end. Although ultimately defeated, Soult's skill as a general remained in high regard, with Wellington even acknowledging his foe's strength in delaying the Allied advance for as long as he did. When the Bourbons regained the throne in 1814, Soult was one of the last marshals to declare his allegiance to them, but his skills as an administrator were still much desired, and by December he was made Minister of War. Upon assuming this new position, he immediately began to alienate the army, particularly the rank and file, firstly with implementing changes aimed at reducing the size of the army, but also with his attacks upon popular figures such as Generals Excelmans and Trevoux. Worse, this dislike quickly turned to disgust once Napoleon landed back in France in March 1815, as Soult took action against not just the emperor, but also those who attempted to support him. He was detested by the entire army. The generals had not forgotten the Excelmans affair, or that after Napoleon had landed, Soult had indicated his intention of having Generals de Erlon, Vandamme, Riel, Dumas, and the Lalemant brothers shot for the abortive coup in the north. Napoleon and the army were also well aware that Soult had done everything in his power to ensure Napoleon's capture, and to carry out Louis's ordinance of 6th of March by bringing the emperor in front of a military tribunal and having him shot. Once Napoleon regained this throne, Soult's allegiance quickly turned, and he asked for employment, but for many in the army it was too late. His sudden conversion to Napoleon's cause, having worked hard to oppose it, was never forgiven by many in the army, and before, during, and after the campaign, he was blamed by many of the junior ranks for the disaster. The suspicion that surrounded him was such that Napoleon himself recalled that at the height of the Battle of Ligny, an old corporal approached him and said, "Sire, don't trust Marshal Soult. You may be certain that he will betray us." Napoleon, however, now facing war on multiple fronts, found many of his former marshals refusing to return. Of particular loss was Marshal Berthier, his ever-present and reliable chief of staff, who instead of rallying to the Eagles, decided to throw himself from an upper-story window. Faced with few options, Napoleon, despite his own personal mistrust of the Marshal, chose Soult as replacement, and he was appointed Chief of Staff to the Army du Nord, a position he had supposedly long coveted. This appointment has come into criticism by many, some even arguing that Soult had limited experience in the role, but this wasn't the case, as he had served in the role for Jourdan during the Battle of Fleurus, and as Field explains, he had spent 10 months as Major General to King Joseph in Spain between 1809 and 1810. Despite his experience and willingness for the job, his work was to come under scrutiny almost immediately upon Napoleon's arrival at the front. The Emperor was annoyed that the 4 cavalry corps were not already on the march to the frontier, but Soult had neglected to send them any orders. Lobau's 6th Corps, marching from Beaumont to Charleroi, ran into the bivouacs of Vandamme's 3rd Corps, who were still asleep, having received no movement order. A lack of orders were also to cause tensions between the newly promoted Marshal Grouchy and General Vandamme, who was supposed to be serving under him, but was refusing to obey direct orders. Whilst Vandamme should have obeyed Grouchy, who was his superior in rank, he was unaware that he was supposed to be directly under the Marshal's command, a communication error that can be laid at the door of Soult. In Vandamme's defence, that having been put under Grouchy's command by Napoleon, Soult, the Major General, must take some of the blame, as he had failed to inform Vandamme of the new command arrangements. Similar issues plagued much of the campaign, and 2 senior French officers commented on the difference between Soult and Berthier's running of general headquarters. Marshal Soult, who had replaced Marshal Berthier as Major General, did not have the same precision nor the same speed in writing out Napoleon's orders. The atmosphere in general headquarters is not that which reigned there when Prince Berthier was found at its head. There was, it seemed, less strictness, less calm and efficiency. Field even argues that Napoleon began to have doubts as to Soult's credibility and reliability in distributing orders. Later in the campaign, Napoleon sometimes wrote personally to his key commanders to ensure that they received their orders. This was something that Napoleon had rarely done prior to this campaign, and must be considered a lack of confidence in his own headquarters and Soult's competence in particular. It would appear then that Soult's effectiveness as a chief of staff was much below the standard set by Marshal Berthier, but whether the reasons for this were deliberate incompetence on the part of Soult due to questionable loyalties, or whether it was simply a case of the bar being set too high by his predecessor, it is clear that his failings did have an impact upon a campaign strewn with miscommunication and delays. Grouchy became what turned out to be the final marshal created by the emperor, and although many have since questioned this decision, it was not completely undeserving. An aristocrat by birth, his military career began in 1781 in the artillery, but upon transferring to the cavalry in 1786, he quickly found his niche. Espousing the cause of the revolution, he rose up the ranks, becoming General de Division in June 1795. Although initially opposing both the formation of the consulate and then the empire, he continued his service, seeing action at most of the major campaigns and battles throughout the period. Although criticised for inactivity and a failure to exploit an opportunity at Friedland, his conduct at Wagram, as well as in Russia in 1812, and especially during the campaign in France in 1814, placed him in high regard as field highlights. Although he may not have had Murat's irresistible dash, he had a fine reputation for the skillful handling of large formations of cavalry. When Napoleon returned to France in 1815, Grouchy quickly rallied to him and earned his marshal's baton after successfully fighting off the royalist army under Duc d'Angoulême before being placed as reserve cavalry commander of the newly formed Army du Nord, a role most usually associated with Murat. Grouchy was probably the best available replacement for Murat, but as already noticed, he was inexplicably transferred from his cavalry appointment at the very outset of the campaign. As Chandler states, although more suited to a cavalry command, once the campaign began and Napoleon divided his army into two wings and a reserve, Grouchy was removed from his role as reserve cavalry commander and instead given command of the right wing, a decision that was to have dire consequences for the emperor. Encountering the Prussians near Gilly on the 15th, Grouchy was slow to engage, angering Napoleon, who was forced to ride up and oversee the attack himself. This delay gave the Prussians more time and space, allowing them to choose their own ground near the village of Ligny, where they fought the following day. This did in fact benefit the emperor, who was hoping to fight and defeat each of the allies before they could unite together. In credit to Grouchy, his conduct during the Battle of Ligny on the 16th was exemplary, managing to keep Thielmann's superior force on the Prussian left wing occupied for much of the battle, allowing Napoleon to execute his main attacks upon the right and centre of the Prussian army. It would, however, be his performance over the next 2 days that would mark his Waterloo campaign and earn his spot upon the list. After defeating the Prussians at Ligny, Napoleon believed them beaten and unable to rally for several days, especially with initial scouting indicating that the Prussians had retreated east upon their line of communications in the direction of Namur. However, later reports revealed that this was only a small portion of the army, and the main force had instead retreated north towards Wavre. Napoleon, wanting to link up with Ney's forces and turn his attention toward the Anglo-Allies, issued orders to Grouchy, assigning him 2 corps, Vandam's 3rd and Gérard's 4th, as well as some cavalry, with orders to pursue the Prussians and prevent them from rallying. Although some critics argue that placing Grouchy at the head of a combined force was far beyond both his experience and his ability, as Field points out, this inexperience was not completely the case. It is wrong to claim that he had no experience commanding infantry or combined arms forces. However, it is certainly true that his greatest achievements were always at the head of cavalry. Others, however, feel that it wasn't a lack of experience, but rather a lack of personality and command that made Grouchy unsuitable for such a position, and although written after the fact, Marshal Marmont felt that giving Grouchy an independent command, especially one of such importance, was beyond his limits and a costly error by the emperor. Grouchy is the worst officer to put at the head of an army. He lacks neither bravery nor some talent for the handling of troops, but he lacks resolution and is incapable of seizing an advantage. This is the worst thing in war. Regardless, the emperor gave Grouchy the command, telling him to clarify the direction in which the Prussians were moving. It is important to penetrate what the enemy is intending to do, whether they are separating themselves from the English, or whether they are intending still to unite, to cover Brussels or Liège in trying the fate of another battle. Despite these orders, the report that Napoleon received from Grouchy on the evening of the 17th was rather ambiguous as to the intention of the Prussians, and Marshal-Cornwall is critical of Grouchy in this regard. After a day's reconnaissance with 2 cavalry corps at his disposal, Grouchy's report was not very illuminating, but it did give a hint that at least part of Blucher's army might be trying to join Wellington. This is perhaps unsurprising, considering that Grouchy's army didn't begin its march until 3 p.m, by which point the rain was beginning to torrent. Although in Grouchy's defence he didn't receive his written orders until around midday, he had been given a similar verbal order several hours earlier, although with Namur as the direction of march. Therefore it seems strange and lacklustre that it still took Grouchy a further 3 hours to get his force moving. Despite these delays and issues, Grouchy's force ended the 17th in pursuit of the Prussians, and still in a position to impact events, but the following day was to mark the lowest point in Grouchy's performance. Starting late once again, it was around midday that the sound of cannon could be heard from Waterloo to the west. Despite both Gerard and Vandam's insistence that they should march to the sound of the guns, Grouchy instead felt that it was his duty to stick absolutely to his orders, which were to follow the Prussians. This is, however, where the Marshal is susceptible to the most criticism. Grouchy is guilty of trying to follow imprecise instructions to the letter. It is patently clear throughout all the communications between Grouchy and Napoleon that his primary role was to ensure that Blucher and Wellington did not join forces. He was to prevent it happening by all means available to him. Simply following the Prussians would not ensure this. Only a move to the northwest towards Napoleon could have done so. As Glover states here, Grouchy's role as the right wing of the army was to prevent the juncture of Blucher and Wellington's 2 armies, and even if this was never explicitly stated in either verbal or written orders, Grouchy, as an experienced marshal, should have surely worked out and understood the role his force was to play within the context of the campaign. It seems clear that both Vandam and Gerard understood, and implored him to march towards the Emperor, but he failed to do so. Although I do agree with Glover's main argument, I have to disagree that Grouchy is guilty of trying to follow his orders to the letter, because I believe that he is guilty of failing to enact a key part of them. The final line of the written order to Grouchy, dictated by Napoleon and scribed by Count Bertrand, reads thus: "Place cavalry detachments between us so as to keep up communications with headquarters." Despite possessing both Payol and Excelmann's corps of cavalry, Grouchy fails to abide by this order, and contact between himself and Napoleon has to be routed back through the battlefields of Ligny and Quatre Bras, rather than simply east to west. This creates a serious delay in communication between the 2 parties. As if to clarify this intention, Napoleon himself, prior to the start of the Battle of Waterloo, instructs Marbeau, commanding the 7th Hussars, to send out patrols eastwards in order to make contact with Grouchy's advance guard, which never arrives. Criticism on both counts are only intensified when one consults the maps and sees that the River Dyle comes between the Marshal and the main army. This was a significant obstacle that not only should Grouchy have understood to hinder any move he was to make in stopping the Prussians from moving west, therefore necessitating his crossing of it, but it also hindered communications, something which sending out the cavalry patrols would have eased. Grouchy passed several bridges on his march towards Wavre, and not once does he stop to consider crossing, nor does he send any cavalry across to make any contact with the Emperor. There are those that believe that, because of Napoleon's own lethargy in pursuing the Prussians after Ligny, that Grouchy, no matter what, would have been unable to prevent the Prussians from joining with Wellington's army at Waterloo. Glover, however, disagrees, suggesting that if Grouchy had indeed listened to his subordinates and attempted to march to the sound of the guns, he might well have prevented much of the Prussian forces from reaching the battlefield at Waterloo. Had he done so, even at this late period, he could have placed troops in a position to the west of Wavre by 2 to 3 p.m, which would have prevented all but Bülow's corps from reaching Waterloo. Blucher would have undoubtedly have turned upon Grouchy with his remaining forces, but he would certainly have ordered Bülow to continue his attack upon Plancois. Thus, Grouchy could have restricted the Prussian support for Wellington at Waterloo to just over 30,000 men. Whether this would still have been sufficient to destroy Napoleon is difficult to answer. Further, even if Napoleon had still succumbed to this force, with Grouchy occupying the majority of the Prussian forces, and with Wellington's army fatigued after the day's events, Napoleon's main force would have been granted a clean retreat, enabling it to rally much sooner, and potentially even continue the campaign. With Grouchy close at hand, Napoleon's army could not have been hounded so effectively afterwards, giving him the chance to turn and fight again once he had drawn all his forces together. Whatever the case, it is clear that the course of action taken by Grouchy did not stop the Prussians from having a significant impact upon the outcome at Waterloo. Although he was able to claim a minor victory at Wavre, it was a tactical one for the Prussians, who successfully held his forces up. To his credit, Grouchy did conduct an admirable retreat and extracted his forces out of Belgium and back to France intact, and once there he successfully rallied the remnants of the army, though by that point it was to prove too late. Whilst Grouchy's inclusion in this list will come as little surprise, I am sure that some would have him higher, and with arguably justifiable reasons, but I myself feel that there are still two people whose mistakes had more impact on the overall outcome. General Drouet, more commonly referred to as d'Erlon, had joined the army in 1782, and he took full advantage of the revolution when it arrived, rising to the rank of General de Brigade in July 1799 and then General de Division in 1803. Under the Empire he fought in all the major campaigns in Central Europe, before being posted to Spain in 1810, and although the French were ultimately pushed out of the peninsula, he proved himself to be a competent and respected corps commander. With Napoleon's first fall, d'Erlon's reconciliation with the Bourbons proved tumultuous, and he was quick to prove where his true loyalties lay in March 1815, as Adkin explains. King Louis made d'Erlon commander of the Lille military district after the Restoration. However, as early as 8th of March, a week after Napoleon's landing near Caen, d'Erlon called out the Lille garrison to march on Paris. This attempt to return to the Eagles was thwarted by the arrival of Marshal Mortier, who persuaded the troops to return to barracks. D'Erlon was locked in the citadel. His jailers released him on the 21st of March, the day following Napoleon's arrival in Paris. Napoleon immediately welcomed him back into the fold and gave him command of 1st Corps attached to the Army du Nord, therefore posed to take a key part in the upcoming campaign. Unfortunately, d'Erlon was to make several key decisions that would cost the Emperor dearly. In the early hours of June the 15th, d'Erlon's 1st Corps, part of the left wing of the army, was ordered to follow Reille's 2nd Corps in crossing the Sambre. However, his advance was lethargic and quickly fell behind schedule. The result of the day was that his troops had seen little to no action, and when his men settled down for the night, they were much dispersed. Although these delays were not entirely the fault of their commander, it would be the events of the next day that would become a black mark in d'Erlon's reputation, and arguably decide the fate of the entire campaign. Despite all the delays, on the 16th, Napoleon, thanks to Allied mistakes, was presented with the opportunity he had hoped for, the chance to fight one of the Allied armies before they could unite, and even before each could gather their total strength. He quickly decided that Blucher's Prussian army, forming up around the villages of Ligny and Saint-Amand, would be the main target, and that Ney, in charge of the left wing, was simply to hold the Anglo-Allies at Quatre Bras and prevent them from assisting the Prussians. Despite the magnitude of this opportunity presented to the French, Count d'Erlon and his corps would spend the entirety of the 16th marching between the two battlefields, taking no significant role in either battle. Worse than that, their only impact would be to turn what could have been a French major victory at Ligny into perhaps a minor one. 1st Corps started the day trying to close up and continued their march towards Quatre Bras. Unfortunately, because of the tardiness of Reille's 2nd Corps, they could initially move no further than Gossielles, as Field explains. Prince Jerome's division, which had bivouacked on the south of the Lombac Wood, which lay east of Gosselies, did not start its move until between 1:30 p.m. and 2 p.m., preventing d'Erlon from starting his own march. D'Erlon was then held up even further by reports that he was threatened by a substantial Allied force to his west, and it was only after he had satisfied himself that this was not the case that he finally began his own move about 3 p.m. Once they were finally on their way, at around 4 p.m., a staff officer for Imperial Headquarters, Colonel Forbin Janssen, rode up carrying orders from the Emperor indicating that 1st Corps was to march upon Ligny, with the idea being that they would fall upon the right rear of the Prussian army. Unfortunately, due to the delays, and because Quatre Bras was still in Allied hands, d'Erlon's men were nowhere near the Namur road, and still much further south than the Emperor believed. Although the order was actually for Marshal Ney, because it concerned his corps, and came directly from Napoleon, d'Erlon immediately turned his corps to the right, and began to march along the old Roman road towards the Battle of Ligny. At around 6 p.m, Napoleon judged that the moment had come to launch his reserves, with the aim of breaking the centre of Blucher's wavering forces. However, just as he was about to send his Imperial Guard forward, General Vandamme rode over from the French left in clear distress, exclaiming that a significant force had been spotted to his rear. The Emperor was puzzled as to the origin of these newcomers, and given their direction was concerned that they were part of Wellington's forces, perhaps coming to the aid of Blucher. Napoleon knew that he could not take a risk at this critical moment of the battle. He forthwith suspended the guard attack and at once dispatched Duhesme's division of the Young Guard to support Vandamme's wavering ranks, while a number of aides were sent off at full gallop to investigate the enigmatic newcomers. By 6:30 p.m, Napoleon's gravest apprehensions had been relieved. A returning aide was able to announce that the threatening column was indeed part of d'Erlon's corps. Why its commander had not followed the standard practice and sent orderly officers on ahead to announce his approach has never been explained. As Chandler points out here, why d'Erlon failed to send out aides ahead to inform the Emperor of his arrival on the battlefield is a complete mystery. It was standard practice to do so, and as an experienced corps commander should have been second nature to d'Erlon, perhaps even common sense given that he should have been seeking further clarification from the Emperor about his direction of attack upon having arrived on the battlefield. The fact that Napoleon had to send out his own aides to ascertain the identity of these troops is a clear mark against d'Erlon. Unfortunately, things were not set to improve. Once aware of their identity, Napoleon immediately sent an aide to d'Erlon, ordering his corps to march towards Waterloo and to therefore enact the outflanking manoeuvre originally envisaged. The aide, however, soon returned with the news that First Corps had turned around and was marching away towards Quatre Bras. Napoleon was stunned, but still having a battle to fight, simply shrugged his shoulders and ordered the final assault with his guard. These elite troops, along with Milord's heavy cavalry corps, succeeded in breaking the Prussian centre and routing them, but because of d'Erlon's interruption, the victory had come too late, and any success could not be properly capitalized upon. The arrival of the First Corps from such an unexpected direction led to confusion in the French ranks, and serious delays in the attack on Blucher's position. This ultimately led to the battle lasting until nightfall, and severely hampered the potential for a French pursuit. The reason for d'Erlon's abrupt change of heart was he had received a message from Marshal Ney ordering him to return to Quatre Bras. Caught in a dilemma of obeying either the Emperor or his immediate superior, d'Erlon chose a middle ground that failed everyone. He left one of his divisions with vague orders to cautiously assist at Ligny, whilst he marched with the remainder of his troops back towards Quatre Bras. Although Ney's orders stressed the urgency and importance of d'Erlon's return, as Field points out, the decision as to which course to take should have been a simple one. The dilemma should have been settled by a simple appreciation of the situation. Although he was not approaching the Ligny battlefield from the direction Napoleon expected, he had a substantial force close enough to be able to make a significant contribution to the combat taking place there. On the other hand, he was 12 kilometers from Quatre Bras, about a 3 to 4 hour march for a complete corps, and it was now too late to make a countermarch and arrive in time to have any significant influence on the outcome of the fighting there. Furthermore, he had received a direct order from the Emperor himself. The actual impact that First Corps would have had upon the Battle of Ligny had they intervened can never truly be calculated, but it is clear that the delay caused by their appearance cost Napoleon vital time in launching his final attack, not only allowing Blucher to reinforce his centre, but also in hastening the approach of darkness, thus allowing the Prussians to escape relatively unmolested. The one advantage of d'Erlon's decision was that First Corps, by seeing no action, were kept relatively fresh, and it is therefore no surprise that they were chosen 2 days later at Waterloo to launch what Napoleon hoped would be the decisive attack upon Wellington's line. Unfortunately, even in this instance, I feel that d'Erlon is eligible for some criticism. Much has been written in the 2 centuries following the battle about what formation d'Erlon's corps took for its assault, but the general consensus seems to be that it was colonne de division par battalion. This was a single column made up of an entire division with a battalion frontage. This formation was unusual but not unique, and has been the subject of considerable criticism. It was much less manoeuvrable than battalion columns, slower with increased difficulties in maintaining dressing over the muddy fields of high-standing crops. It was also highly vulnerable to artillery fire by either canister or round shot, a well-aimed projectile cutting a swathe through the ranks like a ball in a bowling alley. Many people criticise the formation itself as being vulnerable to cavalry, simply because each battalion is in a three-ranked line, but linear formation is not vulnerable to cavalry frontally, only on the flanks and rear, but with such close intervals between the battalions, this formation becomes compact, and in theory at least should be resistant to cavalry, forming a solid rectangle. No, the reason that 900 cavalry were able to rout nearly 13,000 men so easily was not because of the formation shape, but through a combination of surprise and disorder. However, it is to this disorder that the adoption of such a formation did contribute, and to where I will draw my criticism. The first point to draw attention to is the terrain. Facing at least two divisions of First Corps was a hedge, which was inevitably going to disorder any formation attempting to cross it, but by adopting such a wide formation front, reorganising the line once passing the obstacle was always going to be more time-consuming and difficult for the officers and NCOs than a more standard column. It isn't surprising to note that the cavalry struck whilst this reforming was taking place. The second point is that maintaining the alignment of such a wide formation necessitated a much slower pace of march. Once formed up beyond the Grand Battery, the distance between First Corps and the hedge was about 600 metres, and yet it took between 15 to 20 minutes for the divisions to cross it. Their slowness exposed them as a vulnerable target to artillery fire for far longer than had they been in smaller, more mobile formations. Cavalry did not attack them until they had reached or crossed the ridge, so this gamble had paid off. However, by then they had been badly cut up by gunfire, they had lost formation and were confused. Therefore, if the success of the cavalry was in part down to disorder on the part of the French, it is clear that this formation certainly contributed to the confusion. The final point is that by the use of such formation, it necessitated the use of nearly the entire corps, leaving few reserves behind. These reserves would usually be formed up in columns of waiting and could be sent forward to either exploit a potential breakthrough or, if the attack should be repulsed, they could act as a rallying point for the retreating men. By committing nearly all of his men into an attack that failed, it ultimately saw almost his entire effective force routed, and it was to take several hours before they could be rallied and reformed, denying Napoleon much needed resources. Perhaps d'Erlon is a surprising inclusion to some, particularly being so high up on the list, but honestly I am unsure as to why his conduct during the campaign is not placed under more scrutiny. Perhaps it's because he lacks the title of Marshal that makes others an easier target. Regardless, his loyalties, unlike some others on this list, cannot be called into question, though his performance certainly should be, and whilst his choice of formation at Waterloo was simply a gamble that didn't pay off, his decisions on the 16th arguably decided the entire campaign, as Field suggests. Ultimately, and with all the benefit of hindsight, it seems that the failure of d'Erlon's First Corps to intervene at Ligny was probably the pivotal moment of the campaign. Although I do believe that Ligny was the key battle in the campaign, and that d'Erlon's actions, or lack of them, played a key part in its outcome, I still feel that there is one figure that Napoleon could blame slightly more for the ultimate outcome of the campaign. Marshal Ney, arguably one of the most popular figures within the army, had begun his career in 1787, joining a hussar regiment. Proving himself to be an aggressive and fearless leader, he was a Generalty Brigade by 1797 and a Generalty Division 2 years later. In 1802, Ney commanded French troops in Switzerland, whilst also carrying out diplomatic duties, before being placed in charge of the camps at Compiègne and Montreal. Receiving his baton in 1804, he was to command 6 corps with distinction during the campaigns in the following 3 years, though his conduct at the Battle of Jena dissatisfied the Emperor. Moving to Spain in 1808, he won several engagements against the Spanish, but major disagreements with the other marshals, particularly Massena, saw his removal in 1810. The highlight of his career came in the 1812 invasion of Russia, fighting with his usual tenacity at both Smolensk and Borodino, before famously taking charge of the rear guard during the retreat, reputedly becoming the last Frenchman to leave Russia. This feat earned him the title the Prince of Moscow, and an almost heroic status amongst the soldiers. Unfortunately, the campaign in 1813 saw Ney at possibly his worst, failing to grasp tactical and strategic opportunities at both Lutzen and Bautzen, preventing Napoleon from achieving the levels of victory that he required. Although fighting in the defence of France the following year, Ney eventually became a spokesman for the marshals in forcing Napoleon's first abdication, and he quickly offered his allegiance to the reinstated Bourbon regime. Upon Napoleon's return, Ney famously remarked to the king that he would bring the emperor back in an iron cage, but upon speaking with the soldiers, he quickly realized that the army's allegiance belonged to Napoleon, and Ney felt it best to side with them. Although Napoleon welcomed Ney, he sent him to a remote post in the north of France, and seemingly had no role for him in the upcoming campaigns. But when Marshal Mortier fell ill, the emperor told Davout to send for Ney. Send for Marshal Ney, and tell him that if he wishes to be present for the first battle, he ought to be at Avesnes on the 14th. Despite managing to reach Avesnes on the 14th, he was not able to see the emperor until the following day, and even then he was left without orders or a specific command. It was not until he caught up with Napoleon once more, at midday on the 15th at Charleroi, with the campaign already well underway, that he received a command. "How are you, Ney? I am very pleased to see you. You will take command of the 1st and 2nd Army Corps. I will give you, besides, the light cavalry of my guard, but do not make use of it. Tomorrow you will be joined by Kellermann's cuirassier. Now you can go, drive the enemy onto the Brussels road and take up your position at Quatre Bras." It is because of the tardiness of this appointment, as well as the casual nature with which the Emperor handed Ney command of the left wing, that I feel any criticism of Ney for the opening moments of the campaign are massively unfair. He was thrust, unprepared and at short notice, into the midst of operations with no headquarters or staff officers. He had to use officers of the various cavalry regiments to transmit his orders. He did not know who his subordinate commanders were, let alone the composition of their formations. By the end of the 15th, the left wing of the army had penetrated the Allied perimeter as far as Frasne, but, as mentioned in the d'Erlon section, much of the two corps were spent the night stretched out. Therefore, perhaps Ney's first priority on the morning of the 16th should have been to concentrate his forces. On the morning of the 16th, Ney can be criticised for not closing up his command in anticipation of what these orders would be. Doing so would have saved much delay, and why he failed to do so is unknown. Instead, he rode forward to assess the situation around Quatre Bras, where light skirmishing was soon to escalate. Much is made over Ney's cautious approach to the start of the battle, when he had a numerical advantage, and quite probably, had he pressed home this advantage, he would have taken the crossroads. However, this view is very much one of an armchair historian, unfortunately. The battlefield itself was full of undulations, with many areas of dead ground, and Ney, having fought Wellington before in the peninsula, would have been well aware of the Duke's tendency to shield his men from both sight and artillery fire. Therefore, Ney would have been very unaware of just how many men were facing him, and to add to this facade, the Prince of Orange, initially in command of the position, attacked the French in an effort to appear much stronger than he actually was. With this in mind, it is perhaps wise of Ney to act with caution, particularly when he himself only had around a third of his allotted men at the start of the battle. Once reinforced, however, at around 2 p.m. he launched his assault and slowly pushed the Anglo-Allies back to the crossroads, and it was only timely reinforcements and Wellington's cool placement of them that prevented the French from claiming the position. Again, Ney is heavily criticised for not attacking with more elan and taking the position before the Allied reinforcements could arrive, but at this point in the day, the crossroads themselves held no strategic value. As discussed earlier, Napoleon had been gifted an opportunity on the 16th to fight the Prussians at Ligny, and therefore if Ney could prevent the Anglo-Allies from joining them, he would have done his job. The crossroads themselves therefore meant nothing, although the Emperor expected Ney to already be in possession of them, and for d'Erlon's corps to come down the Namur road. Even if Ney did capture the crossroads, d'Erlon would still have been too far behind due to the delays, and would still have travelled up the old Roman road in the same way. Despite Ney's failure to seize Quatre Bras, or for his troops to take any part in the battle at Napoleon fought at Ligny, he had at least achieved something. No Anglo-Dutch forces had been able to provide support for the Prussians as Blucher had hoped. Quatre Bras is labelled as either a draw or a minor victory for Wellington, because he, albeit skillfully, maintained his position. In fact, it possibly should be seen as a French tactical victory, because with an inferior force, Ney managed to prevent Wellington from reinforcing Blucher. However, despite deserving credit for achieving this result, it is to this point that criticism of Ney can also be drawn, because he himself failed to understand the true purpose of the battle and allowed himself to commit men into a needless conflict. He once again repeatedly lost sight of the bigger picture and seemed unable to prioritise anything above the immediate tactical fight that was right before his eyes. The back and forth marching of First Corps was covered in the previous section, and whilst d'Erlon should receive the majority of the blame for the decision, there was no need for Ney to issue his counter-order. Instead, he was too caught up in his own battle, and his desire for more troops only muddied the waters leading to the disaster. There is another instance of criticism that can be put to Ney during the battle, in my opinion, and that is the ordering of Kellerman's cuirassiers to charge unsupported. Firstly, it is strange that despite Kellerman's corps possessing 4 cavalry brigades, only one was in position to make the charge, putting 800 cavalry against nearly 20,000 men. Thiers believes that Ney is to blame for this. The other 3 brigades of Kellerman's corps were kept at Liberchy, about 5 kilometres southwest of Fresnay, in line with the orders of Marshal Ney. It remains a mystery why Ney left such a potent force so far away as to prevent it being available for the battle he was about to fight. Despite the odds, the cuirassiers went forward, catching the 69th Foot in transition, completely shattering them and capturing their colours, but their success was limited, and with so few men and without further support, the brigade was soon routed and falling back, having taken 300 casualties, over a third of their starting strength. It was a waste of fine cavalry in an attack that achieved very little. The charge, though glorious, had been futile and doomed to failure. General Foy described it as feather-brained. Ney must surely have realised that fewer than 800 cuirassiers had no chance of turning the day around, and the fact he ordered the charge is more indicative of his state of mind than it was a tactical miscalculation. Despite the mistakes, Ney had successfully held Wellington, preventing him from supporting the Prussians, and both armies finished the battle unaware as to what had happened at Ligny. However, his good work was about to all be undone by his lethargy the following day. On the morning of the 17th, Wellington remained formed up at Quatre Bras, whilst Ney, at Fresnay, was almost up to his full strength at 37,000 men. However, with no word of the result at Ligny, and unsure as to the strength or intention of the army facing him, Ney's reluctance to launch any sort of attack would seem both sensible and justified. What cannot be excused, however, is Ney's failure to properly scout and monitor the situation in front of him, or to prepare his men for any action. Ney appears to have been struck by a wave of complete apathy. He took no interest in what Wellington was up to at all, made no efforts to comply with Napoleon's orders, and had not even bothered to get his formations ready to move. In spite of the fact that d'Erlon's corps had rejoined him, and notwithstanding the Emperor's orders to press on to Quatre Bras, Ney's troops were still in their bivouacs near Fresnay when about 2 p.m. Napoleon arrived within sight of Quatre Bras. Upon arriving, the Emperor not only found Ney's forces stationary, but he soon realized that the Anglo-Allied army had already been allowed to slip away. In his frustration, Napoleon personally led the pursuit, but it was too late. Only the rear guard gave any sort of resistance, and a monstrous thunderstorm began, slowing the pursuit even further. Wellington's forces were now set up in a strong position guarding the 2 main roads to Brussels, and it seemed that any advantage that the Allies had given Napoleon by their slow start to the campaign had now been taken away. Even without crushing Blucher the previous day, there had still been a chance on the 17th that Napoleon could force battle with Wellington and thus inflict the decisive victory he required, opening up Brussels before turning his attentions back to the Prussians. However, Ney, in his idleness, allowed the Duke to escape to a much stronger position, robbing Napoleon of any chance of forcing battle on the 17th, and committing arguably one of the biggest blunders of the campaign, completely derailing any French momentum. At first light on the 17th, the campaign was still Napoleon's to win, but by lunchtime the Prussians had escaped the punishing pursuit, which would allow them time to rally and reorganize, and Wellington had started his retreat towards the position at Waterloo without mishap. In a few short hours, and without any fighting, the pendulum had swung decisively in favour of the Allies. Despite this definite shift in momentum, when the French army formed up on the 18th to face the Anglo-Allied army on the opposite ridge, there was still a chance of grabbing victory before the Prussians could arrive and influence the final outcome. Some of the errors committed by the French on this day can unfortunately also be laid at the feet of Marshal Ney. The before-mentioned thunderstorm lasted most of the night and hampered the French deployment, delaying their planned assault from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Although Napoleon did oversee this deployment and outline the plan for this initial attack, it seems that he then gave Marshal Ney command in conducting the battle. Tactical command of the battle was to be given to Marshal Ney, although after his rather lacklustre display of command during the previous days, this is rather surprising. This was a strange decision, as Field says, because not only had Ney proven inadequate at this role at Quatre Bras, but Napoleon himself had taken tactical command of Ligny without apparent issue, so why did he neglect such an active role here? Was it fatigue, illness, worry of the Prussians? It is difficult to say, but Ney was to prove a poor substitute, as many historians agree upon. a totally unsuitable appointment for a soldier who could still be relied upon for courage and elan in action, but whose brain was no longer capable of the cool strategic calculations required of a semi-independent commander. Ney's gallantry in action was unchallenged, but he was headstrong and wayward, with little tactical sense. His blunders on the battlefield had led to unfortunate results at Jena, Bautzen, and Dennewitz. On the previous day he had missed a great opportunity at Quatre Bras. At this stage there was no reason why the Emperor should not have conducted the battle himself, without Ney's intervention. At Wagram he had personally controlled a battlefront 5 times as extensive as at Waterloo, and he had there handled twice the number of troops and guns than were now present. The first major assault by d'Erlon's First Corps was covered in the previous section, and whilst Ney might have had some input as to the formation used, I believe that blame mainly lies with d'Erlon for that decision. The criticism I make of Ney in his role as battlefield commander has nothing to do with his bravery. It was in fact quite the opposite, and he was probably too brave and reckless with his life. For too many of the attacks against the Anglo-Allied lines, the Marshal placed himself at their head, which, whilst no doubt inspiring to the troops, prevented Ney from gaining any form of tactical insight or overview of the battle. After the repulse of d'Erlon's attack by the British heavy cavalry, there was a lull in the battle, and the next major attack by the French was to be that of repeated cavalry charges, the first of which was ordered seemingly at the behest of Marshal Ney. The launching of these attacks is not the issue. If he perceived a weakness in Wellington's line, then exploiting it with Milord's cavalry corps, one of the few fresh troops available, was a reasonable decision. However, because Ney, with his immense bravery, insisted upon leading these cavalry attacks himself, he became, in my opinion, too caught up in the action and unable to assess the larger situation developing around him. He allowed these attacks, no matter how well intentioned initially, to devolve into a complete waste of almost the entire French reserve cavalry. The attacks developed into the repeated reinforcement of failure by more of the same, cavalry. There was at least one infantry division, Waterloo, plus one of Foy's brigades, Tissot, some 6,500 infantry that had not been sucked into the Hougoumont meat grinder operation, which, with a little tactical forethought, could have been sent trudging up the slope on the hooves of the horsemen. With anything like decent timing, they would not even have been subjected to much artillery fire during their approach up the exposed forward slope. As Adkin notes, there was infantry available to support these cavalry attacks, but Ney, being caught up in the melee, is unaware of them until it was too late. It was only after the cavalry had exhausted itself and was incapable of sustained effort that Bachelou's division and one of Foy's brigades were committed to an attack on the ridge, and artillery was deployed forward to take the densely packed squares under fire. Field also suggests that Ney's enthusiasm and natural front-line leadership also prevented him from realizing the importance of La Haye-Sainte until it was once more too late. It is surprising that Marshal Ney did not take a more personal interest in the taking of the farm, for he must have appreciated its importance. Once more we must conclude that he was too directly involved in the fighting to be able to coolly direct resources and activity more effectively. The farmhouse was of course taken by the French at around 6 p.m, but by this time the Prussians had already arrived in force, and the battle was, in my opinion, already lost for the French, even before the attack of the middle guard. There is no doubt that Ney was the bravest of the brave, but it seems clear to me that his decisions had a huge impact on the outcome of the campaign. His failure to capture Quatre Bras can of course be excused by the lateness of his appointment, but his inability to understand Napoleon's campaign strategy on both the 16th in recalling d'Erlon, and on the 17th by failing to monitor Wellington and allowing him to escape completely unmolested, no doubt swung the odds of the campaign in favour of the Allies, and were for me the biggest blunders of the campaign. To top things off, his handling of the Battle of Waterloo, although conducted with his usual elan and bravery, lacked the tactical finesse that perhaps would have still offered the French a chance of victory, and it is why Marshal Ney is number 1 on my list. However, as I stated in the introduction, despite my belief that these 5 French officers should absolutely share portions of the blame for the campaign, the ultimate blame can only be put at the feet of the Emperor. Firstly, it was he that elected each of these 5 members into their positions, despite in some cases warnings from other members of the army. It was he that gave independent commands to both Grouchy, who was untested and unsuited for such a role, and Ney, who Napoleon had witnessed disappoint in this role previously. The Emperor should have been well aware of Ney's limitations. As early as 1808 he had likened the Marshal's comprehension of Napoleonic strategy to that of the last joined drummer boy. It is also largely Napoleon's fault that Ney is so unprepared for his role as commander of the left wing, for he appoints him only after the campaign had begun, giving him no time to figure out his command structure. It was also the Emperor that detached a third of his force in a tardy pursuit of the Prussians, defying one of his own military maxims in the process, and repeating the mistake that he made on the eve of Marengo 15 years earlier, though in that instance, unlike Grouchy, his subordinates did march to the sound of the guns, and did save the battle. Finally, it was Napoleon, during one of the most important battles, and knowing that the odds were no longer in his favour, gave tactical command at Waterloo to Ney, again with the knowledge that it was a role unsuited to such a hot-headed character as the Marshal. Although these 5 men can share in the blame and played their part in the defeat, it is ultimately Napoleon's mistakes that had the biggest impact. I'd be interested to know other people's thoughts on this topic. Do you agree with my order, or do you think that these or other characters deserve more or less blame than I have given them? Feel free to comment below, and thanks for watching.